The letter arrived on a Tuesday, dust-worn and creased, addressed in handwriting that trembled like a prayer. James Dalton held it between calloused fingers, standing alone in the shadow of the Salvation Creek saloon, and something in those ink-stained words made him forget, for just a moment, that he was a hunted man. He'd killed someone. That was the first truth. The second truth was that he didn't regret it. The body belonged to a man named Victor Crane, a railroad baron who'd stolen James's claim, his land, his livelihood, and then laughed about it over whiskey in this very saloon. Crane had reached for his gun first. James was faster. Faster, cleaner, and now, officially, a murderer in the eyes of the law. Sheriff Coleman had given him 3 days to ride out of Salvation Creek, or hang from the gallows beside the old courthouse. But the letter changed everything. It came from someone he'd never met. Someone named Eleanor Whitmore. A woman who'd read about his plight in the territorial newspaper, who'd seen his name printed alongside words like cold-blooded killer and dangerous outlaw. Instead of condemning him, Eleanor had written to him. Not once. 17 times over 3 months. Each letter was different. Each one moved something inside his chest that he thought had died years ago in the Kansas dust. Now, with the news tightening around his life, James faced an impossible choice: ride north toward the Canadian border where he might disappear, or answer Eleanor's final letter, the one where she confessed that she'd fallen in love with the man behind the words, the man nobody else could see. The one where she begged him to come to her, consequences be damned. The thing nobody tells you about desperation is that it looks exactly like hope when you're standing at the edge of the abyss. James folded Eleanor's last letter, tucked it into his vest pocket, and made his decision right there in the shadow of that saloon. He was going to ride straight toward the only person in the world who believed he was worth saving, even if it meant riding straight into hell. James had first heard Eleanor's name in the most unlikely place, the library tent that the Methodist Church ran twice a month in Salvation Creek. He wasn't the kind of man to spend his Sundays reading, but that particular afternoon, he'd been running from the law in his mind long before his body followed suit. He needed to think. The library tent smelled like old leather and forgotten dreams, a place where the world seemed to pause. That's where he found her letter. It was published in the Territorial Gazette, a small column titled, "Letters to Men Deemed Unworthy." He almost missed it. The headline should have turned him away. It was the kind of sentimental garbage that appealed to church ladies and dreamers. But something in the first paragraph stopped him cold. "To the man they call James Dalton," it began. "I do not know you. But I know what they're saying about you. And I know they're lying." The letter was from Eleanor Whitmore, a schoolteacher from a town 300 miles northeast called Mercy Falls. She'd written with elegant penmanship about the difference between justice and vengeance, about how she'd watched her own father be destroyed by powerful men who wielded the law like a weapon. She wrote about seeing James's face in the newspaper, a photograph taken when he was arrested, and recognizing something in his eyes that the justice system had failed to see. A man pushed beyond reason, not by evil, but by desperation. Most men would have laughed it off. James Dalton read it 3 times. What followed was a correspondence that changed the shape of his entire existence. Eleanor wrote again. Then again. She didn't ask for his forgiveness or offer him false promises. Instead, she described her life with such precise detail that James felt like he was standing in her schoolhouse, watching sunlight pour through the windows as she taught 30 students their letters. She told him about the books she loved, the dreams she'd abandoned when her father died, the quiet ache of being a woman in a world that saw her as nothing more than a potential wife. And somehow, impossibly, she began to ask questions about him. Not the questions everyone else asked. Not why did you kill him, or are you truly a monster? Instead, Eleanor asked, what did you love before the law loved chasing you? What did you dream about when you were just a boy? What do you think about when you're alone and nobody's watching? James found himself writing back. He'd purchased paper and found a postal agent in the neighboring town of Copper Ridge, a man with a conscience and loose lips, who agreed to mail his letters anonymously. In his correspondence, James described things he never told another soul. The ranch he'd built from nothing. The way the desert looked at sunrise. The sensation of holding something you'd created with your own two hands and knowing that it was good, that it mattered, that it was yours. He wrote about the night Victor Crane showed up with legal documents signed by a judge 2 counties over, documents that essentially erased everything James had built. He described the feeling of watching the life you constructed get dismantled by a man who viewed you as an obstacle, not a person. He told Eleanor that when he pulled the trigger, he wasn't angry, he was simply done. Done with being powerless. Done with surviving. Done with watching the world reward cruelty with gold and position. Eleanor's response took 2 weeks to reach him. When it did, his hands were shaking. "You are not the villain of your own story," she'd written. "They've written you as a villain because they need you to be one. It's easier than admitting the system is broken. Easier than looking in the mirror and asking themselves if they would have done differently. But I believe in you, James. Not because you're innocent of the crime, but because you're innocent of the wickedness. There is a difference, and it matters." That's when he'd fallen in love with her, not with her body, which he'd never seen, but with her mind. With her refusal to accept the simple narrative. With her belief that a man could be pushed beyond the boundary of law and still deserve grace. Now, 3 days before his execution date, with the sheriff's ultimatum echoing in his ears and his horse saddled outside the saloon, James held her final letter. The one that changed everything from theoretical to terrifyingly, impossibly real. "Come to me," she'd written. "Come to Mercy Falls. Come to the schoolhouse. Come in the dark, come alone, come as you are. I have saved enough money to help you disappear. I have contacts in Canada. I have friends who don't believe in asking questions. But more than that, I have to know if the man I've fallen in love with, the man in these letters, is real. If he is, then whatever happens next, at least we'll have this. At least we'll have known each other, truly known each other, before they take you away." James unfolded the paper one more time, even though he'd memorized every word. Eleanor's handwriting was shaking in this final letter, less controlled, more desperate. He could see the fear between the lines, fear that he wouldn't come, fear that he'd judge her for her boldness, fear that the man in the letters was just a fantasy she'd constructed out of loneliness. But there was something else there too. Something that made his chest tighten. She was offering him a way out. She was offering him redemption. And most impossibly, she was offering him love, not the conditional kind, not the kind that required him to be innocent, or righteous or worthy. Just love. Raw, terrified, honest love from a woman who'd never met him but somehow knew him better than anyone ever could. The horse was already saddled. The night was already dark. It was 300 miles to Mercy Falls, and the law was closing in from every direction. Every rational part of his mind screamed that this was suicide, that riding toward Eleanor was just another form of running, just a prettier way to walk into his own grave. But James had stopped listening to the rational part a long time ago. He swung into the saddle, Eleanor's letter tucked against his heart, and pointed his horse toward a woman he'd never seen and a love that shouldn't exist. Behind him, Salvation Creek disappeared into the darkness like a bad dream. Ahead of him, 300 miles of desert and danger stretched out like a promise. It was the most hopeful he'd felt in months. It was also the most terrified. The desert at night is its own kind of truth-telling. There's nowhere to hide from yourself out there, just endless sky, endless sand, and the sound of your horse's hooves counting down the seconds until someone catches you. James rode hard those first few hours, pushing the animal past its normal limits, trying to put as much distance as possible between himself and Salvation Creek. Behind him, he half expected to hear the thunder of hoofbeats, the shout of pursuing lawmen, the crack of gunfire. But it never came. The silence was almost worse. By the second day, James had settled into a grim rhythm. Ride at dawn. Rest during the brutal heat of midday in whatever shelter he could find, a canyon, an overhang, the shade of a sparse sagebrush. Move again at dusk. He rationed his water, his food, his hope. Every mile brought him closer to Eleanor. Every mile also brought him closer to capture. He'd killed a man. That was the immutable fact that haunted him. He could justify it to Eleanor, could write it out in careful letters where he could control the narrative, could frame it as justice in a world without justice. But late at night, when the desert cold settled into his bones and he was alone with nothing but his thoughts, James couldn't escape the weight of it. The weight of Victor Crane's body, limp and final in the dust. The weight of the woman Crane had left behind. She had a daughter, James would later learn. A little girl who'd never see her father again because of his bullet. That was the thing nobody warned you about when they talked about justified violence. The justification didn't erase anything. It just gave you permission to keep living with the guilt. On the fourth day, a dust storm rolled in from the west. James saw it coming from miles away, a wall of ochre darkness that swallowed the sky. He was between settlements, in a stretch of badlands where the only shelter was rock formations and deep arroyos. He made the decision to ride into it rather than wait it out, which probably would have been the smartest choice. But patience had never been his strong suit, and besides, the storm would cover his tracks. The wind hit him like a fist. It came with such force that his horse reared, and for a moment, James thought he'd be thrown into the chaos. But he held on, pulled the animal forward, wrapped his bandana around his face and pressed into the wall of dust. Visibility dropped to nothing. He couldn't see his horse's ears. He couldn't see his hands. He could only feel the wind trying to tear him from the saddle, the sand grinding between his teeth, the raw burn of it against any exposed skin. And then he saw the light. It was small and distant, a lantern shining from somewhere ahead through the storm. James debated for only a moment before pointing his horse toward it. Shelter. Warmth. Maybe danger, maybe not. But he was in no position to be selective. The light resolved into a structure, a small cabin, barely more than a shack, smoke curling from a chimney hole. James approached carefully, hand moving toward his gun out of pure instinct. Cabins like this, in the middle of nowhere, could belong to anyone. Prospectors. Hermits. Lawmen using bait to catch desperate men. He was tied to his saddle, exhausted, and wanted desperately to believe in Eleanor's God right about then. The door opened before he reached it. The man standing in the doorway was older, weathered, with a face like old boot leather and eyes that had seen everything and judged none of it. He took one look at James, one look at the state of the horse, one look at the dust storm that was trying to unmake the world, and simply nodded. "Come on inside," the old man said. "Storm like this, you can't be out in it." James hesitated. He was a wanted man. The last thing he needed was to encounter someone who might recognize his face, might remember his name, might decide that the reward for turning him in was worth more than the kindness in their heart. The old man seemed to read this in his hesitation. He smiled, sad and knowing. "I don't care who you are, boy. I stopped caring about things like that a long time ago. Come on." So James came. Inside, the cabin was warm and sparse. Just a fireplace, a cot, a table, and a shelf of books. The old man introduced himself as Henry and offered James hot coffee and something to eat, beans and cornbread, the simplest food tasting like redemption after 4 days in the saddle. Henry didn't ask questions. He just worked on treating the horse, getting the animal grain and water, making sure it would survive the night. Around midnight, when the storm had reduced to a constant howl and they were sitting by the fire, Henry finally spoke. "You're running from something," he said. Not a question. "Yeah," James admitted. Henry nodded. "Law?" "Yeah." "Did you deserve it?" James thought about that for a long moment. About Victor Crane. About the little girl who'd lost her father. About the line between justice and vengeance, between righteous anger and murder dressed up in noble clothing. No, he finally said. Not in a way that matters. Henry smiled at that. It was an odd response, and he seemed to appreciate the honesty in it. There was a woman once, Henry said, staring into the fire. I had the chance to do something violent to protect her. Something that would have marked me as a criminal. And I didn't do it. I chose law, chose authority, chose to let the system handle it. The system failed her. And I've spent 40 years wondering if I was brave or just cowardly. He turned to James. So maybe the question isn't whether you deserve the law catching up with you. Maybe the question is whether it was worth it. Whether the thing you did, no matter how unjustified, whether it meant something. Changed something. Made something real. James pulled Eleanor's letter from his pocket without thinking. He unfolded it, smoothed it out on his knee, and slid it across to Henry. The old man read it slowly. When he was done, he folded it back up and returned it. She sounds real, he said. She is, James said. Then I guess you know what you have to do. They didn't talk much after that. When dawn came, the storm had passed. Henry gave James supplies, jerky, grain for the horse, a fresh water skin, and a map drawn in careful pencil. Mercy Falls is about 200 miles northeast from here, Henry said. There's a town called Copper Ridge about halfway. After that, you follow the river north. Can't miss it. James tried to pay him. Henry refused. I'm old, the man said. I'm going to die in this cabin in about 5 years, maybe 10. I won't have done anything that matters except this, maybe helping a man reach a woman who believes in him. That's enough for me. As James rode away, Henry stood in the doorway and watched him go. James didn't turn around again. He didn't want to remember anything about that cabin except the warmth and the coffee and the realization that goodness still existed in the world, quiet and unassuming. Hidden in places where nobody was looking for it. 200 miles. He could cover that in 5 days if he pushed hard. And then he would see her. Not through letters. Not through ink and imagination. In person. Real. The thought terrified him more than the law ever could. Copper Ridge was a supply town with 3 saloons and no sheriff, exactly the kind of place where wanted men didn't advertise themselves but also didn't need to hide. James spent one night there, sleeping in his saddle outside the town limits, getting supplies from a general store without making eye contact. He was close now. Close enough that he could feel it. The river route was as Henry had promised, a ribbon of water that ran north through increasingly green country. Mercy Falls, Eleanor had written, was a small town built on the banks of this river. A place where the hardness of the desert gave way to trees and grass and the possibility of life beyond mere survival. As James followed the river north, he could see the change happening gradually. The vegetation grew thicker. The air became cooler. The desert's grip loosened degree by degree. It took him 5 days to cover what Henry had said was 200 miles, and his horse was near collapse by the time he saw the first signs of civilization. A small ranch. Scattered houses. Smoke from a distant chimney. And then, turning a bend in the river where old cottonwoods rose up like sentries, he saw it. Mercy Falls was smaller than he'd imagined. Prettier, too. There was a main street with real buildings, a schoolhouse with a bell tower, a general store, a church. Houses with gardens scattered on either side of the river. People moving about their business. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that James Dalton was riding toward them on a half-dead horse, his heart beating like a war drum inside his chest. Eleanor's schoolhouse was on the eastern side of town, a white building with large windows and a bell tower. James could see into one of the windows, desks, a chalkboard, pictures on the wall. It was early evening, school would be out. He had to find her. He tied his horse at the edge of town and walked. He was dirty, exhausted, wearing the dust of 300 miles of desperation. He looked exactly like what he was, a wanted man. But something about that didn't matter anymore. He was here. He was real. And in a matter of moments, Eleanor would know it too. The schoolhouse was empty when he reached it. He circled around, looking for a caretaker's cottage or a house where a teacher might live. Behind the schoolhouse, he found it, a small, neat cottage with blue shutters and a garden that Eleanor must tend herself. The garden told him things about her he'd learned in letters but never quite believed. She loved growing things, she was meticulous, she believed that beauty was worth working for. The door opened before he could knock. She stood in the doorway, and James's entire understanding of the world reorganized itself in the space between heartbeats. Eleanor Whitmore was not beautiful. That's the first honest thing to know about her. Her features were sharp rather than soft, her face was too thin, her hair was plain brown gathered in a simple bun. She was taller than he'd expected, and thinner, and older than her photograph. She was nothing like the image he'd constructed in his mind during 300 miles of riding. She was infinitely better. James, she said. Just his name. No question. No doubt. Like she'd been standing in that doorway for 3 months, waiting for it to be him. Eleanor, he said back. They stood there for a moment that seemed to contain several eternities. All of it unspoken. All of it perfectly clear. The man in the letters had finally arrived. The woman who'd believed in him was real. You're supposed to be riding toward Canada, she said. I am, James replied. But I needed to stop here first. She stepped aside. Come inside. Quickly. It's not safe for you to be on the street. He crossed the threshold into her home, and Eleanor closed the door behind them. They were alone. After 300 miles and 17 letters, they were finally in the same room, breathing the same air, existing in the same reality. Eleanor's hands were trembling. James could see it. She was terrified. I was afraid, she said softly, that the man in the letters wouldn't be real. That when you came, if you came, I'd realize I'd fallen in love with words instead of a person. James reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. He took her shaking hand in his. Her skin was calloused, warm, alive. And? He asked. Eleanor closed her eyes. When she opened them again, there were tears. You're real, she whispered. God help me, you're real. And then they came together. Not in passion. Not yet. In something deeper. Recognition. The collision of two people who'd built a bridge out of words and now, finally, found solid ground on the other side. Eleanor put her head against his chest, right over his heart. And her shoulders shook silently while James held her like she was the most fragile thing he'd ever touched, and also the only strong thing that could save him. Outside the window, the sun was setting over Mercy Falls, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. And inside this small cottage, a wanted man and a schoolteacher held each other in the gathering dark, finally understanding that love wasn't about being safe. It was about being seen. It was about being known, completely and without judgment, and choosing to stay anyway. Eleanor had prepared for his arrival with military precision. She showed him the documents spread across her small desk, contacts in Canada. A lawyer in Denver who'd agreed, for a price, to explore the question of whether James's crime could be classified as self-defense. Money saved over 3 years of teaching for a salary that barely covered rent. She'd built an escape route out of hope and desperation, and the sheer force of her belief that the man in the letters deserved a second chance. We can leave tonight, she said, pointing to a map marked with safe houses and sympathetic sheriffs. This is the route my uncle, he's a railroad man, he says is least likely to have federal marshals. But James wasn't looking at the map. He was looking at her. Tell me the truth, he said. About how you found my letters. About how this started. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. She walked to her bookshelf and pulled down a worn newspaper, one of the Territorial Gazette issues from 3 months back. The headline read, Railroad baron killed in cold blood, outlaw at large. My father owned a small ranch, Eleanor began. Not like yours. Smaller. Just enough for us to live on. When I was 18, a man came, not Victor Crane, but someone like him. Someone with money and power and lawyers. He wanted to build a hotel on our land. He offered us a pittance. My father refused. She set the newspaper down carefully. The man filed documents claiming my father had stolen the land from his family 50 years ago. It was a lie. We had proof it was a lie. But proof doesn't matter when the judge owns the same bank that's financing your accuser. My father died fighting it. Literally. He had a heart attack in the courthouse when he realized he'd lost everything. James felt the weight of her story settle on his shoulders. When I read about you killing Victor Crane, Eleanor continued, I recognized my own father's helplessness in the way the law described your crime. They made it simple, you see? They made you evil so they didn't have to admit they were corrupt. And I thought, someone needs to tell the story differently. Someone needs to ask questions. So I wrote. And fell in love with a ghost, James said quietly. No, Eleanor said firmly. I fell in love with the truth. With a man who was pushed beyond his breaking point and broke. Not because he was evil, but because the system is evil, and it was easier to destroy him than to fix itself. She walked to him, took his hands, looked directly into his eyes with an intensity that made him feel more exposed than he'd ever felt in his life. But I need you to understand something, Eleanor said. I love the man in the letters. I believe in him. But I need you to be honest with me about something that nobody else asks. What? James whispered. Do you regret it? Eleanor asked. Not because the law says you should. Not because it makes you sympathetic. But honestly. In your heart. Do you regret killing Victor Crane? It was the question he'd been avoiding since the moment the gun discharged. The question he couldn't answer in letters because the answer didn't fit neatly into any narrative. James walked to the window, looked out at the darkening landscape, and finally let himself be completely truthful. Part of me does, he said. The part that knows a man is dead because of me. The part that knows his daughter will grow up without him. That part is horrified. He turned back to Eleanor. But another part of me, the part that was beaten and broken and watching everything he'd built be stolen, that part isn't sorry. That part wanted him dead. And if I'm being completely honest, I'm not sure which part of me is the real James Dalton. Maybe they both are. Eleanor nodded slowly. That's what I needed to hear. Because love is not redemption. Love is not forgiveness. Love is just someone looking at all of you, the broken parts and the angry parts and the parts that aren't sorry, and choosing to hold it anyway. She squeezed his hands. I love you, James. I love the man in the letters. And I'm terrified of the man in the flesh. But I love him anyway. That's when they kissed. Not gently. Not with any of the restraint that had defined their first reunion. This kiss was desperate and passionate, and full of the understanding that they were both complicit now. Eleanor was choosing to help a murderer escape. James was choosing to become complicit in Eleanor's act of defiance against the law. They were no longer just writing about redemption. They were living it, in real time, knowing full well the cost. When they pulled apart, Eleanor's face was fierce. We have maybe 6 hours before someone recognizes you, she said. 6 hours until this becomes dangerous for both of us. We can prepare the horses, get supplies. Or, she paused. Or? James prompted. Or we could stay, Eleanor said softly. Not forever. But tonight. We could stay together, and know each other, and not be running. Just for one night, let the danger wait. Let the law wait. James looked at this woman, this brilliant, brave, beautiful woman who'd fallen in love with words and was now choosing to love the flesh and blood man who'd produced them. He thought about Henry in his cabin. He thought about Eleanor's father dying in a courthouse. He thought about Victor Crane's daughter growing up without him. He thought about the weight of choices and the impossibility of redemption and the question of whether it was better to run or to stand and face what you'd become. "One night," he said, pulling her close again. "And then we run. And then we run," Eleanor agreed. And in the darkness of her small cottage, with the law closing in and the future uncertain, James and Eleanor chose connection over isolation. They chose to know each other not through letters but through presence. Through touch. Through the terrible, beautiful vulnerability of being completely, irrevocably understood. It wasn't redemption. James was right about that. Redemption was the lie that suffering could be erased, that consequences could be avoided, that love could undo violence. This was something more honest. This was two broken people choosing to build something real in the ruins of their broken worlds. Knowing it would likely collapse. Knowing the law would likely catch them. Knowing that love was not enough to stop the machinery of justice, even when that machinery was fundamentally unjust. But for one night, they had each other. And in a world designed to separate and destroy, having each other was revolutionary. They didn't sleep. Instead, they talked through the night, sitting on Eleanor's small bed with a lamp burning on the nightstand, watching the darkness gradually give way to dawn's pale suggestion. James told her about growing up on the frontier, about his mother dying when he was 7, about his father teaching him that survival required hardness. He told her about the ranch, and what it meant to build something from nothing, to create value in a place that had only known emptiness. Eleanor told him about her mother, who'd died in childbirth. About her father's slow descent into depression after losing the ranch, how he tried to drink away the shame. How she'd failed to save him because love is not strong enough against the machinery of systemic injustice. She told him that when she'd seen James's photograph in the newspaper, she'd recognized her father's defeat in his eyes, and she couldn't let history repeat itself. "I felt like if I could save you," Eleanor said, "maybe I could retroactively save him. Like understanding the cruelty you suffered might somehow make his suffering make sense." "It doesn't," James said gently. "Understanding cruelty doesn't redemption it." "I know," Eleanor replied. "But I had to try." As dawn broke, casting gray light through her bedroom window, Eleanor walked to a small chest at the foot of the bed. She pulled out a leather journal, her diary. She opened it, and showed James page after page of entries, written every night for 3 months, each one starting with the words, "Dear James," even though she had no guarantee he'd ever read them. "These are all the things I couldn't write in official letters," Eleanor explained. "All the fears I had about you. All the doubts. All the moments when I wondered if I was insane, if I was writing love letters to a ghost, to a fantasy, to a man who didn't exist outside of my imagination." She turned to the final page. Dated the day before James's arrival. It read, "Tomorrow either you'll come or you won't. If you don't, I'll understand. The rational choice is to run, to disappear into Canada, to become someone new where nobody knows your name. The rational choice is always to run. But I'm begging you, if there's any part of you that's not rational, any part that believes in the possibility of something beyond mere survival, come to me. I have to know if the man in these letters is real. I have to know if our love is real or just beautiful fiction that we've written to make the unbearable slightly more bearable. Come, James. Please come." James read the entry 3 times. Then he gathered Eleanor in his arms and held her while tears, his tears, her tears, they couldn't tell whose was whose, fell quietly. "I'm here," he whispered. "I came." "I know," Eleanor said. "And now we have to leave." It was 5:47 a.m. Outside, the town was still sleeping. Eleanor had 2 horses prepared behind the cottage, her own horse and James's, groomed and loaded with supplies. Enough food and water to reach the Canadian border. Enough cash to establish themselves somewhere new. But as James moved toward the door, Eleanor stopped him. "There's something you need to know," she said. "Something I've been hiding in all my letters." James felt ice in his stomach. What? There's a federal marshal, Eleanor said quietly. His name is Thomas Whitmore. And he's my cousin. James stared at her. Eleanor, he arrived in town 2 days ago. Eleanor continued, the words tumbling out quickly. He's been asking questions about you. He knows someone matching your description has been sighted traveling north. He's putting together a search party. It was supposed to leave at dawn. Eleanor, why didn't you tell me? Because I wanted one night. Eleanor said fiercely. I wanted one night where you were just James, and I was just Eleanor, and the law was something that existed outside of this cottage. I wanted to pretend we had time. I wanted one perfect night before I had to tell you the truth. James walked to the window. Dawn was breaking gray and definite over Mercy Falls. In maybe an hour, people would start moving about. In maybe 2 hours, the federal marshal, Eleanor's own cousin, would begin actively hunting James. Why is your cousin a marshal? James asked. Because someone has to believe the system can be fixed, Eleanor said, her voice raw. He didn't listen to my letters. I told him the truth about Victor Crane, about how the system is rigged, about how men like you are created by injustice. He didn't listen. He said the law is the law, and it has to be enforced, and that mercy leads to chaos. She came to stand beside James, looking out at her town. I have to decide, Eleanor continued, whether to turn you in or help you run. Thomas will be here in an hour. He's my cousin. I love him. He's a good man trying to do what he thinks is right. But I'm also in love with you, and you're a good man who's been pushed into darkness by a system that doesn't care about mercy. She turned to James. I can't make this decision for you. You have to tell me, do you want to run, or do you want to turn yourself in? James felt the weight of the question like a physical thing pressing on his chest. Running meant a life in hiding, always moving, always afraid. It meant becoming everything the law said he was, a fugitive, a criminal, someone with no stake in society, no home, no redemption. Turning himself in meant facing the law that had already decided he was guilty. It meant probably hanging. It meant his death and Eleanor's complicity being discovered, which would destroy her career and her reputation in this small town. Neither choice was redemption. Neither choice was good. I need to tell you something, James said. Something I've been afraid to say in all my letters. Eleanor waited. I don't know if I believe in redemption, James said quietly. I don't know if a man can kill another man and still deserve grace, still deserve love, still deserve a second chance. I don't know if coming here, loving you, escaping the law, I don't know if that makes me redeemed or just prolonging the inevitable moment when I have to answer for what I've done. He turned to look at Eleanor directly. But I know this, I'm not sorry for coming here. I'm not sorry for meeting you. And I'm not sorry for loving you, even though I probably should be. Because loving you is the most honest thing I've ever done. It's the truest thing I am. Eleanor's face broke like dawn breaking. Then we run, she said. We get on those horses, we ride north, and we never look back. They moved quickly. Eleanor left a letter for her cousin on the kitchen table, explaining everything, her reasoning, her choice, her love. It was an act of defiance but also of honesty. Thomas would understand, even if he couldn't condone it. As they reached the horses, as James was preparing to mount up, Eleanor grabbed his arm. Wait, she said. I want you to know something. If this fails, if they catch us, if we don't make it to Canada, I don't regret any of it. I don't regret writing those letters. I don't regret loving you. I don't regret helping you run. Every bit of it was worth it, to know you, to be known by you. James pulled her close one final time. I love you, Eleanor Whitmore, he said. I love the woman in the letters and the woman standing in front of me. I love you completely and irrevocably, and I'm sorry that loving me costs you so much. Love costs, Eleanor said simply. But the alternative, living without it, that costs more. They mounted up. Behind them, Mercy Falls was waking up. The church bells were beginning to ring. Thomas Whitmore was probably already preparing his search party. The law was organizing itself against them, as it always does. But James and Eleanor turned their horses toward the north and rode, not away from the law, but toward the unknown. Toward Canada. Toward whatever version of themselves they might become. Toward a future that would likely end in tragedy, but that was theirs to write. They made it to the Canadian border. It took them 3 weeks of hard riding, of sleeping in the saddle, of surviving on jerky and stream water and the kind of love that sustains the body better than any food. They were pursued. James could feel it, the constant pressure of pursuit, the sense that the law was always maybe a day behind them. But Eleanor was right. There were safe houses, sympathetic sheriffs, people who believed that some laws were worth breaking. By the time they crossed the border into British Columbia, winter was coming. The snow was starting to fall in the higher elevations, and the towns were closing themselves against the cold. They found a small community, barely more than a trading post, built on the banks of a river far enough north that the name, James Dalton, meant nothing. Eleanor got a job teaching at a one-room schoolhouse. James worked for a man who was building a sawmill, using his hands, his back, his knowledge of construction. They rented a small cabin. They built a life. It was not the life they would have chosen. It was not the life that came free of the knowledge of what they'd sacrificed. James still heard about the law sometimes, in letters that reached them through carefully planned channels. Victor Crane's murder remained officially unsolved. The federal marshal, Eleanor's cousin Thomas, had pursued the case for 3 years before letting it go. He never discovered who'd helped James escape. But Eleanor and James didn't talk about that life. That life was memory, grief, the past. The life they built was different. In the evenings, after Eleanor finished teaching and James finished working, they would sit by their fire, and Eleanor would read aloud from books. James would work on furniture, building pieces with his hands, creating beauty from raw material. Sometimes Eleanor would take out her old diary and read entries to him, and James would marvel at the woman who'd loved him sight unseen, who'd built a bridge out of words and then crossed it. 5 years after fleeing Mercy Falls, Eleanor became pregnant. A daughter. They named her Catherine. When James held her for the first time, looking at her small, perfect face, he didn't feel redeemed. He felt responsible in a way he never experienced before. He'd brought life into the world, and he wanted her to have the kind of safety and security that both he and Eleanor had been denied. He worked harder. Saved more. Learned to forgive himself in small increments, the way healing actually works, slowly, incompletely, but persistently. 10 years after leaving Mercy Falls, James received a letter that found him through a series of contacts that had almost gone cold. It was from Thomas Whitmore, Eleanor's cousin. He'd left the marshal service and become a lawyer. More importantly, he'd been working, quietly, to prove that Victor Crane's death was not murder but justified homicide, self-defense that had been mischaracterized by powerful men with interests in keeping the railroads expanding. "I cannot undo what was done to my cousin's heart when she helped you escape," Thomas wrote. "But I can undo the lie that was told about you. If you ever want to come home, I believe I can convince a judge that your case deserves reconsideration. You won't be innocent. But you might be something better, understood?" James held the letter and cried. Eleanor came to him and read it herself, and her hands were shaking. "Do you want to go back?" she asked. James looked around their cabin. He looked at Catherine, sleeping peacefully in her bed. He looked at Eleanor, older now, her hair streaked with gray, her face lined with happiness and hardship in equal measure. "No," he said quietly. "This is home. Your home." "But," Eleanor started. "But nothing," James said. "I don't need redemption from the law. I needed redemption from myself. And I found it here. With you. In this life we built together." James wrote back to Thomas, thanking him but declining the offer. He asked Thomas to ensure that Victor Crane's family was provided for. If there was money to be had from reversing the case, James wanted it to go to his daughter. It was the closest he could come to undoing the violence he'd caused. Not forgiveness. Not redemption. Just responsibility extended across time. Years passed. Catherine grew up. She was brilliant and kind and sometimes heartbreaking in her innocence. She asked questions about her parents, where they were from, why they never went home to visit. Eleanor and James answered honestly, as much as they could. They didn't hide the past, but they didn't romanticize it either. When Catherine was old enough to understand, Eleanor showed her the original letters, the correspondence that had started it all. "This is how your father and I fell in love," Eleanor told her daughter. "Through truth. Through being completely honest with each other, even when that truth was ugly." Catherine read the letters carefully. She looked at her parents differently after, James thought. With deeper understanding. With the knowledge that love was not a fairy tale that swept people away from their darkness. It was a choice, made every day, to see someone completely and love them anyway. When Catherine was 18, the same age Eleanor had been when her own father died, she asked to hear the full story. So James and Eleanor told her everything. The murder. The flight. The risk Eleanor had taken. The life they'd built on borrowed time and Canadian soil. Catherine listened without judgment. When they were done, she took her mother's hand and her father's hand and held them together. "I'm glad you ran," Catherine said simply. "I wouldn't exist if you hadn't. And I wouldn't trade existing for anything." And that, finally, was redemption. Not forgiveness from the law. Not erasing the consequences of the violence. Not even undoing the harm. It was simpler and more profound than that. It was the knowledge that from destruction, something good could still grow. That from darkness, beauty could emerge. That the future could be better than the past, if you were willing to fight for it, run for it, love for it. Years later, when James was old and his hands were finally too stiff to build furniture, he would sit on the porch of their cabin and watch the river flow past. Eleanor would come and sit beside him, and they would hold hands in comfortable silence, and the past would feel like something that happened to other people, in another time, in another country. The law had moved on. Victor Crane was forgotten. Mercy Falls became a larger town and then a city, and eventually nobody remembered the scandal of a schoolteacher who'd helped a wanted man escape. History smoothed over the rough edges, made it a minor footnote in the expansion of the West. But James and Eleanor remembered. Every day they remembered. And they were grateful. Not for the violence. Not for the suffering. Not for the life of fear and running that had framed their beginning. But for each other. For the stubborn, impossible decision to love anyway. For the bridge built out of words that became real enough to cross. For the future that had surprised them both by becoming something beautiful. The world is full of men destroyed by systems that treat them as obstacles rather than people. It's full of women crushed by expectations that confine them to silence and compliance. What made James and Eleanor remarkable was not that they found justice. They never did, not in any official sense. They found something better. They found permission to be human. Permission to be flawed and angry and desperate and still worthy of love. Permission to run from the world's judgment and build something real in exile. The letters mattered. They created space where truth could exist. Where a woman could confess her doubts and a man could confess his anger, and somehow that confession became love. Not healing. Not redemption. Just love, pure and complicated and real. In the end, James Dalton didn't escape the law. He transcended it. Not through innocence, but through choosing to live with the weight of his guilt, while also choosing to build meaning from it. He became not the man the law said he was, but the man the letters revealed him to be. And Eleanor Whitmore, who'd started by questioning a system that failed her father, ended by choosing to live outside that system entirely. She taught schoolchildren in the Canadian wilderness, far from the laws that had betrayed her. She raised a daughter who would question authority her whole life, in kinder ways, with more hope than her parents had managed. Their story is not happy. But it is true. And in a world that too often demands happiness over truth, sometimes truth is the greatest gift we can give each other. Sometimes love is revolution. Sometimes running is the bravest choice. Sometimes the only redemption available to us is the choice to keep building meaning, keep loving truly, keep becoming something more than what the world has tried to make us. James rode toward Eleanor through 300 miles of desert. But more importantly, he rode toward himself. And Eleanor waited, not for forgiveness, but for honesty. That's where real love begins.